A common man saw his life turned upside down when he inherited an unexpected fortune from a distant grandfather. What seemed to be a ticket to a life of dreams soon revealed itself as a nightmare, filled with betrayals, manipulations, and devastating discoveries. Seduced by glamour and deceived by false allies, he lost sight of what really mattered: his family, his values, and the simplicity that once defined him. Amidst the chaos, he found strength to fight against those who betrayed him and rediscover the true meaning of wealth. This is a story of fall, resilience, and new beginnings, where money was not the destination but the teacher. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small kitchen of the two-bedroom apartment where Jack Thompson lived with his wife, Emily. It was another Saturday morning like so many others, with the timid autumn sun streaming through the window and illuminating the simple table where the couple had breakfast. Jack, at 35, maintained his invariable routine. He woke up at 6 a.m. even on Saturdays, prepared coffee, and read the news on his phone while Emily finished tidying up the kitchen. "Don't you ever get tired of this routine?" Emily asked, drying her hands on the floral apron she had received from her mother-in-law last Christmas. Her brown eyes shone with a mixture of affection and concern. "Even on weekends you wake up so early." Jack looked up from his phone and smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. "I guess it's just part of who I am now. 15 years working at the company, always on the same schedule. The body gets used to it." Emily sat across from him, holding a coffee mug with both hands. "Sometimes I think we could try something different. You know that coffee shop we've always dreamed of opening? Maybe if we pooled our savings." Jack sighed, putting his phone on the table. "You know we can barely save any money. The rent went up, the bills keep coming. That coffee shop dream for now needs to remain just a dream." The silence that followed was interrupted by the doorbell. The couple exchanged puzzled looks. They didn't usually receive visitors, especially at that hour of the morning. Jack got up and walked to the door, adjusting the simple white t-shirt he was wearing. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with a tall man in an impeccable suit, carrying a leather briefcase. His graying hair and gold-rimmed glasses gave him an air of authority that made Jack feel slightly intimidated. "Good morning. Are you Jack Thompson?" the man asked, his voice deep and articulate. "Yes, that's me. My name is Richard Miller. I'm an attorney. I represent the interests of your grandfather's estate, William Thompson." The lawyer paused, studying Jack's reaction. "May I come in? I have important matters to discuss with you." Jack hesitated for a moment, trying to process the information. His grandfather, William. He barely remembered him. He had vague memories of a stern gentleman who had visited their house a few times during his childhood, but then simply disappeared from their lives. His mother, Beth, rarely spoke of him. "Of course, come in," Jack responded, letting the lawyer pass. Emily appeared in the hallway, curious about the situation. Jack made quick introductions, and they all headed to the modest living room, decorated with simple furniture and some plants that Emily lovingly cultivated. Richard Miller sat in the main armchair, placing his briefcase on the coffee table. With precise gestures, he took out some documents and methodically organized them. "Mr. Thompson, I came here because I have news that will completely change your life," the lawyer began, adjusting his glasses. "Your grandfather, William Thompson, passed away 2 weeks ago, and you are his sole heir." Jack felt the air escape from his lungs. Emily, sitting next to him on the couch, instinctively held his hand. "What do you mean, sole heir?" Jack asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I barely knew my grandfather." "Your grandfather was a reserved man," Richard explained. "But he was also a very successful businessman. Over the years, he built an empire in the real estate industry, and now all that wealth passes to you." "And how much would this wealth be?" Jack asked, trying to maintain his composure. Richard Miller smiled discreetly, taking another document from his briefcase. "Mr. Thompson, we're talking about assets valued at approximately $150 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily squeezed Jack's hand even tighter, who remained motionless, as if he had been struck by lightning. His mind tried to process the astronomical number he had just heard, but it was as if the words had lost their meaning. This "This can't be right," Jack finally managed to say. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake at all," Richard assured, extending some documents. "Here's the will duly registered and with all legal formalities. Your grandfather was very clear in his provisions. You are the sole heir to all his assets." Jack took the papers with trembling hands, but the words seemed to dance before his eyes. Emily, noticing his state of shock, began to read the documents for him. "And why me?" Jack asked, still trying to comprehend the situation. "Why not my mother? She's his daughter." Richard Miller adjusted himself in the armchair, his countenance becoming more serious. "Your grandfather had his reasons, Mr. Thompson. Reasons that, I'm sure, will become clear with time. For now, we need to start the procedures for transferring the assets and introducing you to the family business." At that moment, as if invoked by the conversation, Jack's phone rang. It was his mother, Beth. He looked at the device for a few seconds, feeling a strange weight in his stomach. How would she react to this news? Why had his grandfather skipped a generation in his will? "You should probably answer," Emily whispered, gently squeezing his shoulder. Jack stared at the phone for a few more seconds before finally answering. His mother's voice on the other end sounded strangely anxious. "Son, are you at home? I need to talk to you urgently," Beth said, not even waiting for a greeting. "Yes, Mom, and coincidentally, I really need to talk to you too. Can you come over now?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm already on my way," she replied, hanging up immediately after. Richard Miller observed the scene with contained interest, organizing more documents on the table. "Mr. Thompson, I take this opportunity to inform you that there are other urgent matters we need to discuss. Your cousin, Luke Thompson, is eager to meet you. He managed some businesses with your grandfather and can help you a lot in this transition." "Cousin?" Jack frowned, looking at Emily. "I didn't know I had a cousin." "There's a lot about your family that you still don't know," Richard replied with an enigmatic smile. "Mr. Luke has great experience in business and—" Before he could finish, the doorbell rang again. Emily got up to answer, and seconds later, Beth entered the room like a hurricane. She was a 55-year-old woman who maintained a natural elegance, even dressed simply. Her brown hair was beginning to show some silver strands, and her usually serene features now showed deep unease. Upon seeing Richard Miller, Beth stopped abruptly. Her face paled, as if she had seen a ghost. "Mrs. Thompson," Richard greeted her with a slight nod. "I imagine you already know the reason for my visit." "How dare you come here?" Beth replied, her voice trembling with contained anger. "After everything that happened—" "Mom!" Jack intervened, standing up. "What's going on? Do you know Mr. Miller?" Beth took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. Her eyes, however, didn't leave the lawyer. "Yes, I do, son, and I don't trust him one bit. Richard Miller has always been your grandfather's right-hand man in all his business dealings." The way she pronounced the last word made Jack feel a chill. Emily, sensing the growing tension, offered to make some tea, but Beth stopped her with a gesture. "No need, dear, I won't be long." Turning to her son, she continued, "Jack, I imagine he's already told you about the inheritance." "Yes, I just found out. Mum, why did you never tell me about Grandpa's wealth? And why did he leave everything to me, ignoring you?" Beth sat heavily on the couch, running her hands over her face. "It's a complicated story, son. Your grandfather and I, we had our differences, serious differences." "You need to tell him," Richard intervened, his tone surprisingly soft. "William is no longer here to prevent it." "Don't you dare tell me." "What to do, Richard?" Beth snapped, her eyes flashing. "You more than anyone know what happened back then." Jack looked from one to the other, feeling increasingly lost. "What's this story? What differences were those?" Beth held her son's hands, her eyes watering. "Son, 25 years ago your grandfather made decisions that changed our lives forever. Decisions that I couldn't accept. That's why we distanced ourselves." "What decisions, Mom?" "Your grandfather was a very ambitious man, Jack. For him, success in business justified any means. And when I say any means—" She paused, as if the words were too difficult. "He did things that weren't right. And when I found out and confronted him, he gave me an ultimatum. Either I accepted it silently or I would be disinherited. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Mrs. Thompson, I believe that's a very particular version of the facts. It's the truth, Richard, and you know it. Beth stood up, exasperated. You were there. You helped with everything. Emily, who had been observing everything in silence, approached Jack and held his arm. He could feel the tremor in his wife's hands. So that's why you distanced yourself? Jack asked, trying to organize his thoughts. Because of these wrong businesses? Yes, son. And now? Beth looked at Richard with contempt. Now they want to drag you into the same world. Your grandfather chose you as heir because he thought you would be more malleable than I was. That's a very serious accusation, ma'am, Richard warned, his polite tone barely disguising the veiled threat. It's the truth, Beth insisted. And there's more, son, this cousin they mentioned, this Luke. Be very careful with him. There are things about him that... Enough! Richard stood up abruptly, gathering his documents. Mr. Thompson, I suggest we schedule a more appropriate meeting to discuss the legal aspects of the inheritance, without emotional interferences. Jack remained silent, his mind spinning with all the revelations. Emily squeezed his arm harder, as if trying to anchor him to reality. Son, Beth approached, her voice now almost a whisper. I know it's a lot to process, but please, before you make any decision, investigate. Find out the truth about your grandfather, about the businesses, about this cousin who appeared out of nowhere. Don't blindly trust anyone. Richard Miller was already at the door, his rigid posture showing his discomfort. Mr. Thompson, I'll be in my office when you want to discuss the next steps. And as for Mr. Luke, he'll arrive in town tomorrow. He's eager to meet you. After the lawyer's departure, a heavy silence fell over the room. Jack looked at his mother, then at Emily, feeling the weight of the revelations and the decisions he would need to make. The restaurant chosen by Luke for the meeting was exactly as Jack had imagined it would be. Luxurious, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling and impeccably dressed waiters. Sitting at a discreet table in the corner of the room, Jack nervously adjusted the knot of the new tie that Emily had insisted he buy for the occasion. Mr. Thompson, a soft voice made him look up. The maitre d' was observing him with a solicitous expression. Mr. Luke has just arrived and asks that you join him in the VIP room. VIP room. Jack took a deep breath, remembering his mother's words from the night before. Don't let yourself be impressed by appearances, she had said. Your grandfather also knew very well how to use luxury to impress people. Following the maitre d' down an elegantly decorated corridor, Jack tried to organize his thoughts. The last 24 hours had been an emotional roller coaster of revelations. Emily had tried to calm him down before he left, but he could see the worry in her eyes. The door to the VIP room opened, revealing an even more refined environment than the main hall. Sitting in a leather armchair, a man of about 40 years old smiled as he saw him. Luke Thompson was the embodiment of success. Tailored Italian suit, luxury watch on his wrist, and an air of absolute confidence. Jack. Luke stood up, opening his arms in a welcoming gesture. We finally meet the family heir. Come, sit down. I've already ordered a special wine to celebrate. Jack shook the extended hand, noting the firm and calculated grip. Luke, I confess I'm a little surprised. I never knew of your existence until yesterday. Ah, yes, Luke laughed, indicating the armchair across from him. Our family has always been complex. Your grandfather, my Uncle William, was a reserved man. He kept the family and professional circles well separated. But now, with you taking over the business, it's time to unite these worlds. A sommelier approached, presenting a wine bottle with reverence. Luke took the moment to study Jack carefully. You have his eyes, you know, the same perceptive eyes as Uncle William. Jack took a sip of wine, trying to buy time to process the situation. Luke, I need to be direct. My mother told me some things about the past, about my grandfather's business. Ah, Aunt Beth, Luke interrupted, his smile faltering slightly. She was always too idealistic. You see, Jack, in the business world, sometimes we need to make tough decisions. Your grandfather understood that. He built an empire by doing what was necessary. And what exactly was necessary? Jack asked, remembering his mother's warning. Luke leaned forward, lowering his voice. Jack, you're now a very rich man. Do you have any idea of the power that represents, the possibilities? Your grandfather didn't just leave money and properties. He left influence, connections, a network of powerful people who can open any door for you. A waiter entered silently, serving dishes that Jack didn't even remember ordering. The aroma of the food was delicious, but his stomach was closed. But first, Luke continued, you need to learn how this world works. Richard told me you work, where again? At an accounting firm. I've been a financial analyst for 15 years. Luke laughed, a sound that mixed amusement and condescension. Well, that ends today. From now on, you're a Thompson. And Thompsons don't work for others. They make others work for them. Jack felt an uncomfortable shiver. There was something in Luke's tone, in his way of speaking, that deeply bothered him. And how exactly do you intend to help me with that? Simple, Luke smiled, taking an envelope from the briefcase at his side. Here's a power of attorney. With it, I can start managing your new assets immediately. I have experience. I know the market. I know how things work. You can continue your quiet life while I take care of everything. Jack looked at the envelope as if it were a snake ready to strike. And why should I sign this? Because you have no idea how to manage a fortune of this size, Luke replied, his voice now firmer. Without experience, without connections, you can lose everything very quickly. There are people out there ready to take advantage of inexperienced heirs. I can protect you from that. How can I be sure you're not one of those people? Luke's smile froze for an almost imperceptible instant. We're family, Jack, blood of the same blood. Your grandfather trusted me. We worked together for years. He would be happy to see us collaborating. Jack picked up the envelope but didn't open it. I need to think about this. Consult my wife, maybe an independent lawyer. Of course, Luke replied quickly, although his eyes had narrowed. But don't take too long. There are important decisions that need to be made in the next few days. Business that can't wait. The lunch continued with Luke telling stories about the empire built by William Thompson, about billion-dollar negotiations and powerful connections. But Jack barely listened. His mind was focused on the envelope in his hands and his mother's. Words, investigate, find out the truth. When they finally said goodbye, Luke made a point of leaving his personal card. Think about what we discussed, cousin. Your life can change completely. Just trust me. Leaving the restaurant, Jack felt the weight of the envelope in his pocket and a growing unease in his chest. Something told him he was just beginning to discover the secrets his inheritance held. Emily watched in silence as Jack paced back and forth in the apartment's living room, still wearing the suit from his lunch with Luke. The envelope with the power of attorney was on the coffee table, untouched since he arrived. You're making me dizzy, she finally said, trying to break the tension. Why don't you sit down for a bit and tell me how the meeting went? Jack stopped, running his hands over his face. It was intense. Lucas is exactly the type of person my mom warned me about. Charming, convincing, but there's something about him that doesn't seem right. And that power of attorney? Sarah pointed to the envelope. You haven't opened it since you got here. I'm afraid of what I'll find in there, Jack confessed, finally sitting down next to his wife. Lucas made everything seem so simple. Just sign and let him take care of everything. But my mom's words won't leave my head. Jack's phone vibrated. It was a message from Richard Mendez. He wants to schedule a meeting tomorrow morning to discuss the asset transfer procedures, Jack explained, showing Sarah the message. And what are you going to do? Jack took a deep breath. I think I need to dive into this world, Sarah. I can't simply ignore an inheritance of this size, but I'm not going to sign anything without understanding exactly what I'm getting into. Sarah got up and went to the bookshelf, returning with a laptop. Then let's start investigating. You have the names of your grandfather's companies, right? There must be information about them on the internet. The following hours were dedicated to research. Jack and Sarah discovered that Augustus Silver's empire was even larger than they had imagined. Dozens of companies, properties in various cities, investments in diverse sectors. But they also found some old news about investigations and lawsuits that had been mysteriously shelved. Look at this, Sarah pointed to a 15-year-old report. Your mom appears here, She requested to leave the board of one of the main companies right after an audit was announced. Jack felt a knot in his stomach. So that's what she meant about not accepting my grandfather's methods. His cell phone vibrated again. Another message from Lucas. Thought about our conversation. I have an important meeting tomorrow with potential investors. Your presence would be crucial. Jack looked at the message for a long time. Sarah, what if I went? Not to sign anything, but to better understand how everything works. Sarah frowned. Are you thinking of accepting? Not exactly, Jack replied, choosing his words carefully. But maybe I need to get closer to discover the truth. Lucas and Richard seem to trust each other a lot. If I keep my distance, I'll never know what's really going on. This could be dangerous, Sarah warned. You saw the news. There's a lot of money involved, powerful people. That's why, Jack argued, an idea starting to form in his mind. I need to understand this world from the inside. But I'll need your help, Sarah. You've always been better than me at perceiving people's intentions. Sarah studied her husband for a moment. In 15 years of marriage, she had never seen him so determined. What are you planning? I'm going to play their game for now, Jack explained, picking up his phone to respond to Lucas. I'll go to the meeting tomorrow, show interest in the business. Let them think I'm dazzled by it all. But meanwhile, we'll investigate every detail, every document, every transaction. And the power of attorney? I'm not going to sign it. I'll say I need more time to analyze it better, that I want to learn about the business first. Lucas seems too eager to get my signature, and that only increases my suspicion. Sarah got up and went to the window, looking out at the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in orange hues. This wasn't the life we planned, she murmured. Jack hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. I know, but maybe it's our chance to do something important. If my mum is right, if there's something wrong going on, I can't just pretend I don't know. Just promise me one thing. Sarah turned to face him. Promise me you won't lose yourself in this world. I saw the gleam in your eyes when you talked about the restaurant, the expensive wine, the meetings with important people. It's easy to be seduced by all of that. Jack gently kissed his wife's forehead. I promise. You and my mum will be my anchors. I won't forget who I am. That night, while Sarah slept, Jack remained awake, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would begin his immersion into the world his grandfather had built. He needed to be smart, cautious, and above all, he couldn't trust anyone but his wife and his mother. He picked up his phone one last time and typed a quick message to Lucas. Count me in for tomorrow's meeting. I want to learn everything about the family business. The response came almost instantly. Excellent decision, cousin. Tomorrow your life really begins to change. Jack looked at Sarah sleeping and whispered to himself, yes, it will change, but not the way you expect. The small cafe in the city center was the kind of place Jack and Sarah used to frequent before. This whole story began. Sitting at a discreet table in the back of the establishment, Elizabeth nervously stirred her cup of tea while listening to her son recount the events of the meeting. So that's it, she sighed after Jack finished his account. They're still using the same methods, nothing has changed. Sarah, who had remained silent until then, leaned over the table. Mrs. Elizabeth, I think it's time you told us exactly what happened in the past. We need to know what we're up against. Elizabeth looked around, making sure no one was close enough to hear. You're right. It's past time to reveal everything. She took a deep breath before continuing. 25 years ago, I discovered that your grandfather was involved in a complex money laundering scheme through the group's companies. Jack felt his stomach churn. How did you find out? I was the CFO of the main holding company. One day I found strange documents, transfers that didn't make sense. When I started investigating, I realized there was an entire network of shell companies, inflated contracts, bribes. Elizabeth paused, as if the memories were too painful. And Richard? What was his role in all this? Richard was more than just the group's lawyer. He was the architect of the whole scheme. He created the companies, structured the operations, ensured everything looked legal in the eyes of the authorities. Sarah took her purse and pulled out a laptop. That explains some things we discovered. Look. She opened a spreadsheet she had created. In the last 5 years, Several group companies have made significant transfers to other companies that, when we researched, seem to have no real activity. And there's more, Jack added. That residential complex they keep talking about? The area is an environmental preservation zone, but Lucas mentioned contacts that could resolve this. Classic, Elizabeth shook her head. Your grandfather always said everyone had a price. It was just a matter of finding the right value. But what about this Lucas? Sarah asked. You said you had something important about him. Elizabeth hesitated, her fingers tightening around the cup. Lucas isn't really family. Jack felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. What do you mean? He showed up about 10 years ago with documents that proved he was the son of your grandfather's brother. Documents provided by Richard, of course. Your grandfather knew it was all fake, but Lucas was smart, ambitious, willing to do whatever was necessary. He was exactly the kind of person your grandfather wanted by his side. So he's an imposter, Sarah whispered, shocked. A very competent imposter, Elizabeth confirmed. In a few years he became your grandfather's right-hand man, and now, she looked directly at Jack, he wants to do the same with you. Jack leaned back in his chair, trying to process all the information. That's why they're so eager for me to sign the power of attorney. With it, Lucas would have total control over everything. Exactly, and considering the value of the inheritance. But why did my grandfather choose me as his heir, if he trusted Lucas so much? Elizabeth took her purse and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Because your grandfather wasn't as foolish as they thought. I found this among his things after he passed. It's a letter addressed to you. Jack took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was aged, but the seal had never been broken. I didn't open it, Elizabeth explained. It was for you, but I think now is the right time. Carefully, Jack opened the envelope and began to read aloud in a low voice. Dear grandson, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer here, and the plan I devised is underway. You must be confused, maybe even scared by everything you're discovering. First, I need to ask for forgiveness from you and your mother for the mistakes I made. Elizabeth was right to distance herself, to protect you from the world I had created. But now I need your help to correct these mistakes. I chose you as my heir because I know you have your mother's character, the same integrity that made me lose her. Lucas and Richard think they can manipulate you, use you as they used me for so many years. They don't realize that this is your greatest strength. Along with this letter, I left a flash drive stored in the safe at the beach house, the one you visited a few times in your childhood. In it is all the documentation needed to expose what really happens in the companies. But be careful. These people are dangerous when they feel threatened. Use the inheritance not to perpetuate my mistakes, but to correct them, and ask your mother for forgiveness for me. I never had the courage to do it personally. With love, your grandfather, Augustus Silver. A heavy silence fell over the table as Jack carefully folded the letter. The beach house, he murmured. Does it still exist? Elizabeth nodded. It's been abandoned for years. No one has been there since. We need to go there, Jack declared, a new determination in his voice. Right now. Sarah took his hand. Jack, we need to be careful. If what your mom said is true, if Lucas finds out. He won't find out, Jack assured. I'll continue playing the role of the dazzled heir. Meanwhile, you two go to the beach house. It'll be safer that way. Elizabeth looked out the cafe window, observing the movement on the street. There's something else you need to know, she said, her voice trembling slightly, about how your grandfather really passed away. The sun was beginning to set when Sarah and Elizabeth arrived at the old Silver Beach house. The place was exactly as Elizabeth had described, a mansion by the sea that, despite years of abandonment, still retained traces of its former grandeur. The garden, once meticulously cared for, was now overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the walls was peeling under the effect of the sea air. Are you sure we weren't followed? Sarah asked, nervously looking in the rearview mirror for the 10th time since they left the city. I'm sure, Elizabeth replied, taking out an old set of keys from her purse. Jack is keeping Lucas busy with that board meeting, and Richard is at the courthouse handling another case. I checked personally. The two women crossed the abandoned garden, their footsteps echoing on the stone path covered with dry leaves. The creak of the front door as it opened seemed amplified by the silence of the place. "This is where it all started to fall apart," Elizabeth murmured as they walked through the house's interior. "It was in this house that I confronted Augustus for the last time, before I distanced myself for good. The interior of the mansion was like a time capsule, furniture covered by dusty sheets, old photographs on the walls, frozen memories of a time that now seemed so distant. "The safe is in the office," Elizabeth explained, guiding Sarah down a hallway. "Augustus was always meticulous with his important things. If he said he left something there, it will still be exactly where he placed it." Meanwhile, in the city center, Jack was participating in his first official board meeting. Lucas had insisted on his presence, arguing that it was time for him to start getting more actively involved in the group's decisions. "As you can see, gentlemen," Lucas presented, gesturing to a graph projected on the screen, "the residential complex project already has buyers interested in 60% of the units, even before construction begins." Jack observed everything with heightened attention now. Each number presented, each proposal made, everything seemed to have a hidden meaning that he was beginning to understand. Back at the beach house, Sarah and Elizabeth finally reached the office. It was an austere room with bookshelves covering the walls and a heavy solid wood desk in the center. "The safe is behind that painting." Elizabeth pointed to an oil painting depicting a ship on the high seas. Carefully they removed the painting, revealing a digital safe embedded in the wall. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment. "The password—" She bit her lip, thoughtful. "Augustus always used important dates." "How about Jack's birth date?" Sarah suggested. Elizabeth typed in the numbers, and the safe remained closed. She tried a few more combinations without success. "Wait," she said suddenly, her eyes watering. "I know." She typed in a new sequence, and this time the safe opened with a soft click. "It was the date of my wedding," Elizabeth explained. Her voice choked. "Even after everything, he never forgot." Inside the safe, besides documents and some old jewelry, they found a brown envelope, and inside it, the flash drive mentioned in the letter. There was also another, thinner envelope with Elizabeth's name handwritten on it. "This wasn't mentioned in the letter," Sarah observed. Elizabeth opened the envelope with trembling hands and began to read silently. As her eyes scanned the lines, tears began to roll down her face. "Mom?" Jack answered, the phone discreetly, taking advantage of a break in the meeting. "Did you find it?" "Yes," Elizabeth's voice trembled. "But son, there are more things you need to know. Your grandfather. He left another letter. For me. He explains everything here. About Lucas, about Richard, about how he discovered I was being deceived." "Tell me later," Jack interrupted, seeing Lucas approach. "I have to hang up now. Are you safe?" "Yes, but—" Elizabeth hesitated. "Jack, be careful. In the letter, your grandfather mentions that Lucas has dangerous connections, people who would do anything to keep their secrets hidden." Jack hung up the phone just in time to see Lucas standing in front of him. "Everything okay, cousin?" Lucas asked, his usual smile seeming more forced than normal. "Seemed like an important conversation." "Nothing much," Jack forced a smile. "Just Sarah. Asking what time I'll be home." Lucas nodded, but his eyes had a different gleam. "You know, Jack, I've been thinking, how about visiting your grandfather's old beach house? It's been abandoned for years, but it was a special place for him. We could go there one of these days." Jack felt a chill run down his spine, but kept his expression neutral. "Sure, that would be interesting, but I can't today. I have other commitments." "No problem," Lucas smiled, putting his hand on Jack's shoulder. "There's no rush. After all, the house isn't going anywhere, right?" As he returned to the meeting room, Jack quickly typed a message to Sarah. "Leave there now. Lucas knows about the house. Be careful." At the beach house, Sarah and Elizabeth were hurriedly putting away everything they had found when they heard the sound of a car approaching on the stone path. Sarah and Elizabeth exchanged panicked looks as they heard the car tires on the gravel. With quick and silent movements, they stored the documents and the flash drive in their bags. Elizabeth closed the safe and, with Sarah's help, replaced the painting on the wall. Through the back door, Elizabeth whispered, guiding Sarah out of the office. There's a passage that leads directly to the beach. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the abandoned property, followed by male voices. Sarah immediately recognized one of them. It was Richard Mendez. In the city center, Jack could barely concentrate on the meeting. His cell phone remained silent, with no response from Sarah or his mother. Lucas, sitting across the table, watched him with an almost predatory interest. "So, Jack?" Lucas's voice brought him back to reality. "What do you think of the expansion proposal?" Jack forced himself to smile, maintaining the facade. "It looks promising, but as I said before, I trust your judgment on these matters." "You?" "No," Lucas leaned forward. "Sometimes I wonder if you really trust. I've noticed you've been asking a lot of questions lately, investigating old things." Before Jack could answer, his cell phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "They're safe. Meet us at Aroma Cafe at 7 p.m. Come alone, writing Charlie." Charlie. The name hit Jack like lightning. It was his grandfather's old security guard, someone Elizabeth had mentioned as a trustworthy person. "Any problem?" Lucas asked, noticing the change in Jack's expression. "No, just Sarah asking about dinner." Jack put away his phone, trying to appear casual. But back to the expansion. Meanwhile, in a small beachside inn a few miles from the Silver House, Sarah and Elizabeth were trying to catch their breath. A tall man with graying hair, who introduced himself as Charlie, watched them with concern. "Augustus asked me to keep an eye on the house," he explained. "When I saw Richard's car approaching, I figured you'd need help." "How can we trust you?" Sarah asked, still suspicious. Charlie took an old photo from his pocket, showing himself younger next to Augustus and a teenage Elizabeth. "Charlie was more than just a security guard," Elizabeth explained to Sarah. "He was the only one my father really trusted. He was the one who helped me gather the first evidence against Richard so many years ago. And now I'm here to help again," Charlie completed. "Augustus contacted me weeks before he passed. He said he had prepared something important in the safe, something that would need to be protected when the time came." Sarah took the flash drive from her bag. "This?" "Exactly, but it's not safe to open it here. We need to find Jack first." At the beach house, Richard Mendez and two men methodically searched the office. The lawyer stopped in front of the open safe, his face contorted in an expression of contained fury. "They were here," he said to one of the men, "and apparently they found what they were looking for." "What do we do now?" "Notify Lucas. Tell him the plan needs to be accelerated. We can no longer wait for Jack to sign the power of attorney voluntarily." Back at the meeting, Jack noticed a subtle change in Lucas's behavior. The cordial smiles had given way to a calculating, almost threatening look. "You know, Jack," Lucas said as the other board members left the room, "I've been thinking. Maybe I've been too patient with you. Sometimes we need to be more direct." "What do you mean?" "I mean you have until tomorrow to sign the power of attorney. Otherwise—" Lucas left the sentence hanging in the air, his smile now completely gone. Jack maintained his composure, although his heart was racing. "Are you threatening me, Lucas?" "Imagine that." Lucas laughed, but it was a cold laugh without humor. "Just making the rules of the game clear. You're not the first rebellious heir I've had to deal with. Your grandfather also resisted at first, you know, until he realized that certain things are inevitable." Jack slowly stood up, holding his briefcase tightly to disguise the tremor in his hands. "I'll think about it." "Think fast," Lucas warned. "Oh, and send my regards to your mother. I hope she enjoyed her beach trip today." Jack felt his blood run cold, but he kept walking towards the door. He needed to stay calm, get to Aroma Cafe, and find out if Sarah and his mother were really safe. Then, with the evidence from the flash drive, he could finally expose the whole truth. As he drove through the city streets, Jack didn't notice the dark car discreetly following him. In the passenger seat, Richard Mendez was talking on the phone. "He's going somewhere, want us to intercept him?" Lucas's response was direct. "No, let him go. Now that we know they found the flash drive, we need to change our strategy. After all," his voice took on a dark tone, "it's time to show our dear heir what happens to those who try to be smarter than us." Aroma Cafe was nearly empty when Jack arrived, precisely at 7 p.m. His heart raced as he saw Sarah and his mother seated at a table in the back, accompanied by a man he recognized from old family photographs, Charlie, his grandfather's former security guard. "Thank God you're all right," Jack embraced Sarah and Elizabeth before sitting down. When Lucas mentioned the beach house, "We made it out in time," Charlie explained, his deep and calm voice contrasting with the tension of the moment. "But Richard and his men were right behind us. Luckily, I know that property like the back of my hand." Sarah placed the flash drive on the table, partially hiding it under a napkin. "We haven't opened it yet. We thought it best to wait for you." Jack looked around, making sure no one was watching them, and connected the flash drive to his laptop. The screen soon filled with meticulously organized folders, typical of his grandfather. "My God," Elizabeth whispered as they opened the files. Augustus documented everything. There were spreadsheets, contracts, emails, photographs, a detailed record of years of fraudulent operations. But what caught their attention most was a folder titled Lucas' True Identity. "This confirms everything," Charlie pointed to the screen. "Lucas Silva is actually Paul Mendez." "Mendez?" Jack interrupted. "As in Richard Mendez?" "His son," Charlie confirmed. "They orchestrated it all together. Paul assumed the false identity of Lucas Silva, infiltrated the company, gained your grandfather's trust. The plan was to gradually take control of everything." "But why did my grandfather allow this if he knew the truth?" "He found out too late," Elizabeth explained, leafing through more documents. "When he realized who Lucas really was, he was already too involved in the schemes. They had evidence against him too." "So he prepared all this," Sarah concluded. "He chose Jack as the heir, left the evidence hidden." "It was his contingency plan," Charlie agreed. "He knew that you, Jack, had the same sense of justice as your mother. He knew you would do the right thing with this information." Jack opened another file, a video. In it, his grandfather, looking tired but determined, spoke directly to the camera. "Jack, if you're watching this, it means you found the evidence I left. Richard and Paul, whom you know as Lucas, built an empire of lies using my name and my company's. I allowed this out of weakness, out of greed, and that will always be my biggest regret. But you can correct my mistakes. On this flash drive is everything the authorities need to dismantle their scheme. Use it wisely." The video ended, leaving a heavy silence at the table. Jack closed the laptop, his mind working rapidly. "We need to act soon," he finally said. "Lucas, or rather Paul, has gave me an ultimatum. He wants the power of attorney signed by tomorrow." "They must be desperate," Sarah observed, "if they discovered we have the flash drive. And they're watching you," Charlie added, making a discreet gesture with his head. "There's been a man in the black car across the street since we arrived." Jack felt a chill down his spine. "How are we going to deliver this to the authorities without them intercepting?" "I've already thought about that," Charlie smiled for the first time. "I have some trusted contacts in the federal police. We can—" Jack's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Lucas. "Extraordinary meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Your presence is indispensable. Subject, transfer of controlling interest." "They're not going to wait until tomorrow," Jack showed the message to the others. "They're preparing something." "Then we need to act tonight," Elizabeth decided. "Charlie, contact your people. Jack, you need to go home normally, keep up appearances. Sarah, you come with me and Charlie. We need to put this plan into action before it's too late." Jack hesitated. "I don't like the idea of us separating." "It's safer this way," Charlie assured. "If they're watching you, we need you to maintain your normal routine. Meanwhile, we can work without drawing attention." Sarah hugged Jack tightly. "Everything will be all right. Tomorrow, when you walk into that meeting, it will all be resolved." They said goodbye quickly, leaving the cafe at different times to avoid raising suspicion. Jack watched in the rearview mirror the black car following him back home, trying to stay calm. In a few hours, the entire criminal scheme of Lucas and Richard would be exposed. What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, Lucas was also making his own plans for the next day's meeting. In his office, he observed some recent photos of Jack and his family, a sinister smile on his face. "Tomorrow, dear cousin," he muttered to himself, "you'll learn that some secrets come at a very high price." The meeting room on the top floor, Of the building was silent when Jack arrived, exactly at 9 a.m. Lucas, or rather Paul, was already there, along with Richard Mendez and some group executives. The smile on the two men's faces made Jack feel a chill down his spine. "Good morning, cousin," Lucas emphasized the last word with irony. "Ready to finally take on your responsibilities?" Jack adjusted his tie and sat down. On the table, a folder of documents awaited his signature. He needed to buy time, just a few more minutes. "Before anything else," Jack began, "I'd like to better understand some points about the business administration." Richard Mendez leaned forward, impatient. "Mr. Jack, I believe we've already discussed all the necessary details in the past few weeks. Now is the time for action, not more questions." "On the contrary," Jack replied, keeping his voice firm, "I think it's time for answers. For example, why did Paul Mendez need to create the false identity of Lucas Silva to infiltrate my grandfather's companies?" The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas Paul lost his smile while Richard visibly paled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lucas tried to maintain his composure, but his voice trembled slightly. "Yes, you do," Jack continued, standing up. "Just as you know about all the money laundering schemes, the shell companies, the fraudulent contracts. My grandfather documented everything." Richard abruptly stood up. "This is absurd. You have no proof." "I have all the proof," Jack interrupted. "And at this very moment, they're being delivered to the proper authorities." As if responding to his words, a commotion began in the hallway. Through the glass walls of the meeting room, they saw federal police agents entering the floor, led by Charlie. Lucas Paul reached for his phone, but Jack was quicker. "Don't even try. Your accomplices downstairs have already been detained. It's over." "You idiot!" Lucas snarled, his face contorted with anger. "You have no idea what you're doing. The empire your grandfather was built on lies and corruption," Jack completed. "And you and your father tried to use that to take control of everything." The agents entered the room, led by a detective who immediately began reading Lucas and Richard their rights. The other executives, stunned, watched the scene in silence. "Mr. Silver," the detective addressed Jack after the two were handcuffed, "your mother and your wife are downstairs. They helped us a lot in the last few hours." Jack nodded, feeling an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. In the hallway, as he was being led away, Lucas still tried one last provocation. "You destroyed everything. Years of work, connections, power. You threw away a fortune." "No," Jack calmly replied. "I chose to do the right thing, something you would never understand." Hours later, Jack, Sarah, and Elizabeth were sitting on the house porch, still processing the day's events. The news was already circulating in the media. Millionaire fraud scheme dismantled. Heir exposes corruption in business empire. "What are you going to do now?" Sarah asked, holding her husband's hand. "With the companies, with the inheritance?" Jack smiled, for the first time in many hours. "Remember that old dream of ours? The cafe?" Sarah's eyes sparkled. "Really?" "I'm going to sell most of the companies once this storm passes. We'll keep only the legitimate businesses that weren't involved in the schemes. The rest, well, I think it's time we realized our dream." Elizabeth watched her son with pride. "Your grandfather would be proud, son. In the end, he knew how to choose the right heir." 3 months later, on a quiet street in the city center, New Beginning Cafe opened its doors. It was a cozy place, with soft music and the irresistible aroma of freshly roasted coffee. On the main wall, an old photo showed 3 generations of the Silvers, Augustus, Elizabeth, and Jack, in one of the rare, happy moments they shared. Sarah, arranging flowers on the tables, smiled as she saw Jack personally preparing coffee for the first customers. He seemed lighter, happier. The fortune he had inherited now had a different purpose. Part of it was allocated to social projects, another part invested in ethical and sustainable businesses. The cafe quickly became a meeting point in the city. People didn't come just for the exceptional coffee or the treats prepared by Sarah. They came for the atmosphere of authenticity and simplicity that the place conveyed. On a quiet morning, as Jack organized some things at the counter, an elderly customer commented, "You know, young man, Sometimes true wealth isn't in the size of the bank account, but in the peace of mind we feel at the end of the day. Jack smiled, looking at Sarah serving some tables, at his mother chatting animatedly with regular customers, at his grandfather's photo on the wall. "That's true," he replied. "The real inheritance I received wasn't the money or the companies. It was the chance to do the right thing and build something meaningful." The doorbell chimed, announcing new customers, and Jack returned to work, happy with his choice. The silver fortune hadn't disappeared. It had just found a better purpose, transforming into something that no amount of money could buy. An authentic life, built on true values and honest relationships. And so, in his small cafe, Jack discovered that he had inherited something far more valuable than millions. The opportunity to write his own story, this time with pages filled not with secrets and lies, but with simple and true moments of happiness.